the meeting from this point forward. Thank you. Chris?
Thanks, Don. It's exciting to see everybody logged in here. Give me 1 minute while I get the screen share going, and then I'll take you through the ordinance. All right, I think we're almost all loaded up. Okay, well, again, thanks everybody for being here tonight to learn about this ordinance that we're working on, and we have been working on since last August. And I'll go ahead and tell everybody when we get started, this is anticipated to be reviewed by City Council for the first time on August 25th. So that's Monday. So I'll take you through what this looks like and what we're going to present. First of all, talking about what this process is today. So this is an introduction of tree preservation requirements into our Unified Development Ordinance. And if you're not familiar with that document, that is basically the document that contains our zoning and environmental protections for land when development activity occurs. So right now we don't require the preservation of existing trees on development projects outside of a few pockets that are on steep slope zones or aquatic buffers. So what we want to do is introduce these canopy preservation requirements onto developments that have existing qualifying trees on site. And why we're doing this, it's supported by a lot of things. The comprehensive plan, Living Asheville, which a lot of you heard about, it was adopted a couple of years ago. We have identified 4 specific goals and outcomes from that document that this furthers. And that's always an important part of any ordinance on land development we push forward, is furthering that comprehensive plan. We've also have a few supporting studies that have been done. There was a developed national program study that NASA worked with the Urban Forestry Commission on, and that studied the effects of urban heat island and things like that in the city, and that's very strongly tied to tree canopy and forestation. And then, of course, a lot of you probably followed the urban tree canopy study that was put out last fall, which measured our rate of canopy loss and our current amount of canopy that we have now. Both of those studies showed that we have a need to put an emphasis on preserving and maintaining our tree canopy for many reasons. Trees, of course, are important for stormwater control, urban heat island control, very long list. So throughout this process so far, we've worked really closely with the Urban Forestry Commission. Don identified them earlier. That is a group, that is an official commission that works with the city of appointed individuals. And they really help steer us with a small subgroup. We've tried to balance that by also working with our development customer advisory group. Now that's a group of folks who build things, draw things, develop things, engineer things in the city, and work with development services a lot. Worked with the Sustainability Committee, been before the Planning and Economic Development Committee, the Downtown Commission, and even the Chamber of Commerce. And there have been a few smaller appearances and things that we've done as well. But we've done a few presentations as we've gone through and tried to incorporate all the feedback we can throughout this process. So let's talk about the ordinance itself. And first of all, let's talk about what this will be applicable to. So the ordinance is going to require that folks preserve or plant trees. It's going to require that we have tree canopy associated with development. And that's going to be applied to subdivisions, any place we're creating a new lot of land for development. Steep slope and aquatic buffer zones, as are defined by the ordinance. They are what they sound like. They're around running streams and steep slopes of land at certain elevations. Any new commercial buildings, new open uses of land, and again, that's new commercial open uses of land. So if it's a new parking lot, that's really the best example. We just call it open uses of land because people always find new ways to use land, so we don't want to have it in. Building expansions, commercial building expansions that are over 1,500 square feet, and expansions of those commercial open uses of land that are over 3,000 square feet. So we're not capturing the smaller commercial expansions, and we're not capturing residential, single-family residential activity. So that means what this is not applicable to are single and 2-family residential dwellings. So we're not putting these requirements on individual single-family homes or small commercial expansions. we're also, this is not applying to instances where a small business comes in and just does work inside a building either. So this is just to that list that was on that last slide there. So that's important to keep in mind. I did have a conversation with a home builder this morning and was assuring them that, yeah, this does not at this time apply to single family home construction. So the easiest way to understand this ordinance is kind of walk through how we derive the requirements for a site. And what you'll see here are the key elements of this ordinance. And we have 4 key things that we're working with here. We're going to establish resource management districts, and canopy classifications, and then canopy preservation requirements for each classification. And then I'm going to talk to you all about the flexibility that we've built into this ordinance to make it predictable and easy to use for both the people regulating and the people trying to preserve the trees while they're developing. So that's important. And in my years, I've learned development regulations go a lot better when they're predictable and easy to use. So first of those things, first that I mentioned was a resource management district. And what we have done, we are proposing resource management districts based on the future land use categories that were identified in the Living Asheville Comprehensive Plan that I referenced earlier in the presentation. And I'll blow this up a little. I always like to say the shape of our city limits makes it really hard to fit on a landscape screen. But you can see here we have 3 resource management districts. In purple, we have a downtown resource management district. That is what you would think, mostly that is our downtown area. And we have an urban and a suburban resource management district. Our urban district is mostly composing of your more traditional neighborhoods, traditional commercial corridors, and suburban is more of our suburban farm areas. And what we were able really to do was kind of correlate this as well as we could. We could take an existing land use tool and correlate that kind of with our levels of tree canopy throughout the city. The correlation that happens is your suburban land use, your resource management district really falls in some of our higher existing tree canopy areas and in some of our larger commercial corridors as well. And you'll see why that's important in just a moment. So once you've identified the resource management district in which a piece of land falls, the next thing to do would be to identify what the canopy classification requirement is. And we do that by cross-referencing that resource management district that we just found by the land use that someone's proposing when they develop. So these are broad general land uses, but you see residential subdivisions, because again, single family residential is not applicable to this. Multifamily developments, institutional, commercial, and industrial. You cross-reference that with your recently derived resource management district, and you find out if you're a class A, B, or C site. Class A, B, and C is important because the ordinance itself contains 2 tables. And for this presentation, you'll see them broken up into several slides, but really it's 2 tables. It's going to tell you something. If you're a class A site, for instance, if we go back, you're a multifamily building in the downtown resource management district, then these are the percentages that are required. Now, a little later down in this presentation, you'll see how we come up with the numbers to arrive at these percentages. But what we're looking at here is the percentage of the site area, right? The size of the lot that has to be preserved in tree canopy area. And one of the key characteristics you'll see as we step through these tables is when you're working with the number for existing tree canopy preserved, you'll see a lower number than you will for new tree canopy installation required. So your first column here shows the percentage that's required to be preserved. Your middle column shows the percentage that's required to be planted in new tree canopy. And the third column is really just simple math. It's showing how we arrive at both of those. So this is where the flexibility begins. Let's say if someone was able to preserve 3% of the site area in tree canopy, then they would need to plant 4% for a total requirement of 7%. But if they're able to preserve trees completely to meet that, then their total requirement is 5%. And you'll see that persist throughout these different classifications. Class B, this is mostly going to fall in what you saw as our urban resource management district. Again, the lower percentage happens if you're able to preserve all the trees to meet your requirements. And then Class C, the same thing persists, but what you will see, did mention that Class C tends to fall where a lot of our more heavily treed areas are now, where a lot of our canopy is now. So this is context based on what your existing tree canopy coverage is. So the higher tree canopy coverage you start with, the higher requirement becomes for planting the site. And the reason these tables do this is to provide an incentive for folks to preserve trees rather than planting new trees. We started out with this whole process thinking it would be great if we could just say we have to preserve the trees that are on site, but flat paper sites don't exist. We can't also render sites undevelopable, so flexibility became key. So here is the first of a few ways that I'll show you that we're incentivizing preserving trees over planting new trees. And this table just illustrates that concept. The green bar is preserving tree canopy, while the blue bar is planting new tree canopy rather than preserving. And you'll see when you preserve on the left-hand side, your total requirement is less than as you begin to take out existing trees and plant new trees. Now, calculating tree canopy credits. So this is how we get to how do we equate tree canopy size to the size of the lot or the site area to get that percentage. So we have two tables in front of you right now. One that shows us how much credit you get for preserving certain trees, and one that shows how much credit you get for planting certain trees. And all of this is based on our preferred species list that we maintain as a city, where we classify these trees as small, medium, or large. And when the trees are identified, the trees that are intended to be used to meet the requirements are identified, the diameter, breast height, or the width, the size of that tree trunk is also called out. And we'll use that to figure out how much credit you get for preserving one of those trees. The other table here is credit for planting trees, and you do get less credit for planting a tree. Yeah, sure, in a great world, that tree is going to grow up to be a big tree and give you full canopy, but it does take some time. And again, we want to incentivize preserving trees over planting new trees. So giving more credit for those preserved trees is another way to do that. So all that is a little confusing. So what I'm going to do is we have what I call a site that doesn't exist in Asheville, but also a flat paper site, an example site here. I'm going to kind of walk you through how this all works, right? So here we have a 1 acre site that is 35% covered in tree canopy right now. So we're going to make some assumptions about this site. It's in the Suburban Resource Management District. Like I said, it has 35% existing canopy, and it's a commercial use that's going in. So we have a few outcomes that can happen here. This one represents full canopy preservation. So in this case, they have preserved trees to meet their full canopy requirement. And what you see here is in the darker green in the top right-hand corner of this lot, you see 15% or 6,534 square feet of preserved tree canopy represented. The other thing you see on here that I've just highlighted in red, these are trees that are required by other sections of the Unified Development Ordinance. So these are street trees and parking lot landscaping. Those trees are not affected by this ordinance. They do not count to meet these requirements unless they are able somehow to preserve an existing tree to meet that requirement. So we're getting those trees now. Those trees will still be happening with the development. What the net gain from this ordinance in this site is in the dark green on the top right. That's the preserved tree canopy. So again, this is a full canopy. They've decided to preserve trees to completely meet that requirement in this instance. Our next scenario would be a partial canopy preservation. If you remember that table, it's kind of like a choose your own method of compliance. How much am I going to preserve? How much am I going to plant? Well, in this case, they've chosen to preserve, up in the top right-hand corner again, about 9.3% of the site in existing tree canopy. You'll see to the left of that, you see some symbols labeled NC. Those represent new canopy trees or the new plantings that would be required. And again, highlighted in red, you'll see the trees that are required by other portions of the UDO. Now, one difference you'll see here in these two slides that makes this comparison a little messier than we'd like is that on this slide, it took a little more room to preserve that much tree canopy. So the developer had to build a 2-story building for the same size rather than a 1-story. So what you'll see here is that results in a smaller footprint of the building and also a little bit less required landscaping by the UDO right now. So you see more trees highlighted in red on this larger footprint than you did on that. But what really to focus on is at the top where we have our preserved tree canopy and our new tree canopy. The third scenario involves no canopy preservation. So in this case, they have, for whatever reason, taken out all the existing tree canopy and opted to do that full planting. So in this case, they're dealing with a higher requirement to replace that canopy, and they're also getting lower credit for each tree. So up at top, we see NC again represents new canopy, and still highlighted in red, those are the trees that we currently are required for commercial developments, this type of development by the Unified Development Ordinance. So in each scenario, we do have a fair amount of tree canopy being added in addition to what is currently there right now. And the important concept on this example, this being a level 1 commercial building, and level 1's our lowest level of review at the city. This currently would not require anything above the trees highlighted in red if it were to be built. So that's why I say the net gain is in that new and preserved tree canopy. The third option that comes along is a payment in lieu of planting. And again, we want this ordinance to be easy to follow, and we want it to result in every project that's applicable resulting in adding or enhancing the tree canopy in the city, rather than a lot of projects opting out for variances or relief valves from this. So the third option is payment in lieu of planting. And what this slide in front of you right now means is that this is only available for that new tree canopy installation required number. Basically, you can't say I would have preserved 5% of the site, but I'm going to pay for it instead. You have to work off of that 10% number here, like an example in this table. And that payment in lieu of planting, now these numbers are based on that example site we were just looking at. So if their total requirement for total planting, back here again, that 10%, was 8,712 square feet, then to pay to do that, and actually I can't fully, let's see, there we go. I had our pictures blocking part of the screen here. The payment for that is based on the per square foot cost of land in that resource management district, a per square foot administrative fee, and a per square foot tree installation fee, which we derived out as an average number to install per square foot of tree canopy. And again, you'll see at this table that goes below, you know, there are options for flexibility here. Folks could preserve some and pay for some. This example you see in front of here assumes paying for the entire tree canopy requirement. And it results in a pretty large payment, a pretty large number there. And that was okay because we really want this to be the last case scenario for someone to come into compliance. If someone does come into compliance this way, it does enable us as a city to, again, enhance and expand the tree canopy of the city as a result of this development, but it would result in loss of trees on that site. Now, they could choose here, this is not an interactive version in front of you, they could choose to preserve 3,920 square feet and pay for 3,485, which would result in this number getting lower. So again, there are a lot of options here for folks to come into compliance. And let's see. So a couple of details about this payment in lieu of planting. Those funds that are collected, they have to be used in that same resource management district where the development project occurred. So if the project's downtown, the funds have to be used downtown and so on. And those funds must be tied to the installation, administration, and maintenance of the city's tree canopy. So if there's a park where trees could be put in nearby, then that could work. You know, the administration of these funds hasn't been fully planned out yet, aside from these rules, because we don't know yet how much use this fund will get, all those things. But there's lots of possibilities. It could take the form of you know, partnering with a third-party agency to help us get money out there for people to plant trees on private land even, because that does also make up the trees canopy. But it does have to be used within that same district, and it has to be used for trees. Again, talking about, as we went through this, this is just a recap of what we're doing is incentivizing preservation over planting or payment. We'd rather them keep existing trees than remove trees at all. So again, the numbers are lower for preservation than for planting. And then also here, you get 35% less credit for planting new trees than you do for preserving existing trees. So again, it's advantageous to preserve trees here. And we just went over the payment in lieu of compliance option, which is expensive, but is based on average cost of land and planting of trees. So it is hopefully a last resort effort for most of our developers. Some general highlights of the ordinance, things we didn't necessarily go over, but are important points. We showed those trees in red on the example site. If those trees are able to be preserved from existing trees, then they can count towards this requirement that we're talking about tonight. On that site, none of those trees were really in that boat, but occasionally we'll get a tree over on the side that's close enough to the parking lot to count, in which case they could get credit for that as well. It does replace our current ground-based tree save requirements. That's important because we have a lot of regulations competing for square footage of ground area, setbacks, you know, current open space requirements, things such as that. And there's only so much ground space on each lot, right? It does require permits for future removal of trees that are in those preservation areas. So not for all trees moving forward, but for trees that were used to meet this requirement at the time of development that are in that area, there is a permit required to remove those in the future if they are diseased, dead, or dying. We do allow for multiple methods of calculating the existing canopy. So for very large sites, we do have some alternatives to how to calculate that. And again, we talked about this incentivizes preservation over replanting with measurement flexibility and lower canopy requirements. There are multiple methods of compliance that are available. We talked about plant, preserve, I'll say it the wrong way, preserve, plant, or payment. This gets us out of a scenario where folks are asking for a lot of variances or trying to get out of the requirement altogether when there are other options to go down. And another important part is this will require and enforce active protection for trees while projects are under construction. Sounds fancy, but it just means we protect those trees that are identified to be preserved while construction's happening so that they can actually live through the construction process. Okay, so that is my summary of the ordinance. Don, I don't know if you're ready for questions now, or I'll let you kind of drive that part.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That was a very thorough and relatively easy to understand presentation about the ordinance amendment. So thank you for that. We've had a couple of questions come up during your presentation that Ed Macie has been addressing, but there's a couple that I think maybe you could answer as well.
Sure.
So I can point that out to you. Let's see. So Chardin Dietrich asks, if this doesn't apply to new residential building, what percentage of the potential canopy loss does this actually apply to? And why is it not being applied to the single family residential building?
So that is a good question. When we've been through this whole ordinance, we have looked at it with an eye towards, well, there's a couple of prongs to an answer to that. But one of the things is we have constantly looking at this with an eye towards affordable housing. So we've been careful on impacting housing prices, which is naturally what happens. Also, we're looking at infill lots in the city now being as small as 4,000 square feet. So it becomes difficult to do canopy measures and protection and get a building envelope out of a lot of that size. Now, it's important to note that new lots that are created, when we take one larger lot, we take one 8,000 square foot lot and cut it into two 4,000 square foot lots. Tree canopy preservation area has to be created on both of those new lots. So in that way, a new residential structure that went onto one of those new lots wouldn't be dedicating preservation at the time they built the new structure, but that protection area would already be there from the subdivision action. So we feel like we are catching some of our single family activity, but not on existing lots in the city right now. And there are a lot of actions, like our smaller commercial developments right now don't require any trees outside of parking lots and building impact. And that's a huge portion of the development activity we see in the city right now. So we do feel like there's a huge benefit to moving forward this way already without necessarily directly impacting existing single family lots and permitting on those.
Thank you. And Ed, is there anything you would like to add to that answer?
No, I think Chris answered that question very well. I did see a question that Jeffrey Habron just threw up there about asking if there's any spatially explicit incentives and cost differences based on existing heat islands or environmental justice areas. And this amendment does not address that, although we talked about it a lot in the development of this amendment. And one of the things that the Urban Forestry Commission is recommending is that City Council adopt a zero net loss canopy resolution, which does speak to these environmental justice and heat island issues by recommending over the course of the future that the city employ a broad range of programs, practices, and policies involving partners such as GreenWorks and others to reverse the loss of canopy. We recognize that this amendment is just a first good start, but there's a lot more that we need to do into the future, and especially to address some of these environmental justice issues.
Right. Yes, this is a first step, and it's a big step in the right direction, having not had any tree protection at all in the history of Asheville, except on steep slopes.
Correct.
So more questions are coming in. One from Callie Warner is there any possibility for developers to plant trees on rooftops, as was demonstrated by the couple who spoke about rooftop trees? I know this question came up previously about green roofs in an earlier presentation.
So this has come up a couple of times when we've talked about it. I'm not aware of a good cost-effective method for planting actual canopy trees on rooftops. But Ed, you may know more than I do about that.
I think this will probably fall into that category of we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I mean, if it's a good design, a design that suggests that the trees will survive, obviously we don't put large canopy trees on rooftops, but smaller trees that would shade the rooftop, I think could possibly be counted. But the proof's in the pudding, and we have to see what the design looks like first. So that's probably a conversation we'll be having in the future. It's a good question.
There's a question from Chardin about ensuring the trees live to 15 years and ongoing compliance with this requirement.
Sure, I think that starts with proper planting and protection of the trees at construction. So that's the first step to that. We do have standards in place and details in place for how a tree should be protected, how a tree should be planted. So that gets us there to start with. Enforcement of this is difficult, like enforcement of a lot of city ordinances is. Some of these trees may be deeper onto sites and things like that. And we aren't on everybody's land all the time. I'm sure not everybody wants us on their land all the time too, nor do I want to be there, but it does make enforcement a little bit more difficult. A lot of things happen complaint-based in the city, and we will react to those. But during construction, we have folks on site every 2 weeks. They'll be evaluating the health of the trees, the protection of the trees, and that all measures are being followed. afterwards, we're going to rely on what we're able to see and hear about, just like we do with everything. And I would love to have a better answer for that, but we just don't have the resources to catch it all. Definitely.
Chris, if I might add, there is one better answer, and that's that the canopy protection areas have to be recorded with the plat. So the canopy requirement stays in place in perpetuity. So if there is problems with declining canopy on these projects, for example, if trees die from construction damages, the city does have recourse to go back and have some trees replaced.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Yep.
if a tree needs to come out, that permitting process requires getting a permit to take it out, but also to replace that tree as well. So,
Right.
Yeah, it's a good point. The ordinance does require that it appear on plats.
And
So-
the city has the resource of groups like Asheville GreenWorks and the Tree Protection Task Force, who will be out there as added eyes on properties to notify the city of any problems or challenges with with compliance with requirements, as we do with, say, like the topping of trees on commercial properties.
And that is appreciated.
There were a couple of questions that came up about protecting the roots of trees on these properties and educating builders and developers as to how to protect trees on construction sites. And this is going to be a pretty steep learning curve for a lot of people. My guess is even the city staff will have to learn how to review plans and sort of understand what the limitations are with trees and with trees with respect to building construction. So the Urban Forestry Commission has offered to work with the city to provide some expertise as we're going through that learning curve. And I'm hoping that GreenWorks will facilitate some training programs coming into the future so we can launch this thing off the ground in the right direction.
There is a question from Kat McReynolds about applicability.
Mhm.
She says, you mentioned that two-family residential projects or duplexes are exempt. However, when you build multiple duplexes on one site, is it considered, it is considered a commercial site by the city. So would this ordinance apply to sites with multiple duplexes?
Yes. So if the duplexes are on one lot, then actually you're looking at, from a zoning perspective, a multifamily development, because let's say you have 3 duplexes on one lot, you have 6 units on one lot. So that's what is going to be the difference in this regard.
And Callie Warner asks, will a replacement tree need to be the same size as the one that died in the case of construction damage?
It would need to be the same same class as what came out. Obviously, it's a big mature tree. We can't necessarily replicate exactly what it was at the time, but we would go back to that preferred species list and need to match that up with the size and sorry, words are failing me right now, the mature size of that tree, the same type of tree that has that potential, that growth potential.
Right. So if a 3,200 square foot tree died from construction damages, then they would have to put 3,200 square feet back, which would be based on projected growth, 2 large mature growing trees, or 2 trees capable of becoming large trees, large shade trees.
That's correct.
I want to go back to Jeffrey's comment earlier about the net loss does not address spatial explicit areas, who gets the tree canopy and who doesn't. That is something that GreenWorks is looking at as a whole. We're identifying priority areas based on demographics and vulnerability to the effects of extreme heat and areas that have low tree canopy and areas that have a high population of individuals over 65 and who are in a lower income bracket. So not just looking at where there are no trees and there's canopy needed, but who needs the canopy the most and prioritizing tree planting in that way. Mary
Mary Weber's asking some technical questions about the interface between this amendment and the requirements in the UDO, and I would like to defer that question to Chris if that's possible.
Yeah, I see one. I saw a couple of questions from Mary here, kind of about that. But the easy rule of thumb on that is if we're preserving existing trees to meet those requirements of a type B buffer or building impact landscaping, then those trees can be used to count towards the canopy, the Article 19 requirements. If we're planting new trees for that, they do not count towards the requirements. So anything out of 711 that we preserve for can kind of cross-pollinate with these requirements.
I see that Amber Weaver made a comment following up on Dawn's comment about the demographic overlay with restoring canopy. And Amber's suggesting that the climate resilience assessment would be useful for answering those questions. And I agree with that. That's a good comment. Thanks.
Callie asks, are the preferred species native to this area? There is a preferred species list that is in the process of being revised and approved, and not all of the preferred species are native to this area, but the majority of the trees and shrubs on that list are. Other questions?
I think I saw one on here about, does the ordinance provide language for refusing a development to move forward due to the environmental loss? And I think the answer for that is just that if they don't meet the requirement, they can't get development approval. So yeah, essentially, yes, not in this amendment, but as a overall, the UDO does have language that if they don't meet those requirements, the approval is not granted.
Callie asks, what's our sense of the council voting for this? I can give my point of view on that. I think that there is a high probability that council will vote in favor of this amendment. And I say that because for one, the city manager, Deborah Campbell, asked her staff to develop the ordinance amendment, and the staff did a great job of that over many months, working in partnership with the Urban Forestry Commission and the Development Consumers Advisory Group, and has been presenting it to other boards and commissions to get input. I also believe that the advocacy that's been done in favor of this ordinance amendment has been great. We've had over 100 people emailing and writing letters and calling council members to encourage them to support this amendment. And I've heard that the council members have heard those requests. So at least they're hearing them and they can feel the pressure. So I believe that it will be passed. Ed, do you have anything to add to that?
I couldn't agree more with what you said, Dawn.
Okay, I think this is a question for Chris and maybe Ed from Chardin. Where did the required percentages for canopy preservation replanting come from? The percentages shown in the table in your slide presentation, Chris.
So way back when we started this, we did a lot of benchmarking on what other people were doing with tree preservation requirements, and it's one of those areas where a lot of people are doing it, but everybody's doing different things, so that made it more difficult. But we were able to find some standards and some standards that were working across the kind of Southeast. We had to go outside of our usual North Carolina seek and find. And these numbers were really derived from what seemed to be successful models in the region, where we saw that development was happening and trees were being preserved and funds were being generated and it was working. So that was our main indicator.
Thank you. Karen asks, what will the process be for prioritizing previously redlined areas, even if they are not in the current canopy loss overlay district? And will this go through the Urban Forestry Commission?
So we recognize that where this ordinance really has a chance to work equitably across the city is through the distribution of the funds that are generated from it. Through the maintenance and installation of new tree canopy, because development sites have to be contained on that development site when they plant or preserve trees. So our opportunity to kind of reach out and figure out where it goes is through that program. And as I said before, we have an eye towards that needs to be part of this as we develop a policy with the UFC on how these funds are spent and how they are committed to folks. But that's kind of within, we don't anticipate having funds rolling in to spend right away, right? It's more of we build up some funds and then we program them. So as these accounts build up, we're going to work with the UFC to program them and come up with the fair and equitable ways to program these funds. They do have to be tied to the resource management district where they're collected. So we are going to be restricted by that. And that's part of our legal impetus for doing this. It does require us to do that. But within that district, we have a lot of leeway. So we have the ability to guide those funds and get that canopy where it is most needed.
Also, Asheville GreenWorks has been working with the Housing Authority for the City of Asheville for many years now. And now the Urban Forestry Commission is in support of working with the Housing Authority to prioritize canopy restoration in public housing developments in partnership with the community members. And also through our twice annual tree giveaways, we are working with specific communities that can receive free trees to plant and in their neighborhoods with our support. And Chris, did you address whether or not, or what the role of the Urban Forestry Commission will be in this?
In administering this, well, we've tried to make it, development review level stuff, and the options for compliance are all things they choose and just work with. But right now, we do envision working pretty closely with the Urban Forestry Commission to work on programming those fee in lieu of funds to figure out how those are accessed and how those are best distributed. And that's where we've gotten so far. The other important element is we are working to do more periodic updates of the species list for the Urban Forestry Commission. And the species list, while it's not part of this ordinance, it's leaned on very heavily by this ordinance. So keeping that fresh and accessible is very important as well. So outside of all the technical assistance and whatnot we've gotten from the Urban Forestry Commission and ordinance development, I guess I would summarize and say right now we're looking at the species list and programming those fee in lieu of funds that are collected.
We have another question from Pat McReynolds that either you or Chris or Ed can address. Have you considered letting projects under a certain square footage, which by definition have less impact on canopy, self-inventory their trees instead of being compelled to hire a landscape architect or an arborist? Photo proofs will be required and inspections held if info is insufficient. What is the rationale behind requiring builders to hire these professionals, and are you open to any leniency on this?
So I'll answer from the city side on that. It is that, so that would require us on staff to have someone who could truly evaluate the health of the tree and make a certification as to how it was doing based on the photos or inspections, and we don't have that at the city. We have one arborist for city who deals with all of our public trees and is not somebody we can put out on these development sites because it would just be too numerous. So that leads us really to be able to lean on someone's professional certification to indicate the health of the tree that's being used to meet this requirement. Hopefully that makes some sense. We don't have the certified expertise on staff to make that determination.
That's correct, Chris. And typically, many communities would have the expertise on staff, but would still require professionals in the preparation of plans. It's not as much measuring the canopy. Pretty much anybody could do that using shape files from aerial photographs or going out on site and physically measuring the canopy. But it's the condition of the trees and how they're going to be impacted by construction activities and the development of the tree protection plans that really requires a professional expertise. After being in this business for over 35 years, I've learned that I really can't trust builders' instincts on tree biology, and that professional expertise is going to make all the difference in the world.
So Kat added that she's speaking more for lots that only have a handful of healthy trees.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately the same scenario for us because we'd have to be able to certify the ability of these trees to meet that requirement, moving forward and at the time of development.
Okay, well, it looks like some people are getting punchy in the chat. So are there any more questions for Chris and Ed? So the question that just popped up is, if the ordinance is enacted, will the canopy in Asheville increase or stay the same?
Boy, I guess, part of what we hope to do is reevaluate how this is working over the course of the next year. And eventually, a few years out, we'll probably do another canopy analysis to see how we're doing with this and other practices and programs that we're talking about. So ideally, canopy will increase. I'm optimistic that 5 years from now, we'll have an increase in canopy. And our goal is 50% canopy by 2040, up from 44% now. So we hope to recover the losses that we've had over the last 10 years and then some to address the emerging climate issues.
Sophie asks, will this go into effect immediately if council approves?
So in this new world of Zoom meetings and everything being done through the screens, council has to act a little differently. So on August 25th, there'll be a public hearing and council will consider this amendment. But due to the requirements for public comment after the public hearing remotely, council can't have a vote on the same night. So right now, it looks like the public hearing will be on August 25th, but they won't vote on it till the following meeting, which I believe is September 8th. Now, once the vote occurs, unless something changes, we have not proposed like a deferred effective date or anything like that. So right now it's designed that if they vote on the 8th, it should be in effect on the next day, on the 9th.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris and Ed and everyone who's attended this evening. If you have any more questions, you can email me at dawn@ashevillegreenworks.org, and I will pass your questions on to someone who can answer them if I'm unable to answer them myself. And thank you for your continued support of these programs and having a strong urban forest in Asheville. Thank you all. Have a good evening. Bye.